Hey everybody, first of all I need you to turn to page 54 of your PDF handout or on your computers and put the little 5-4 right there in the number section. Okay, we're working main idea. Main idea, central theme, central idea, main point. All these are clue words in test questions that kind of lead you to the same thing, the general meaning of a passage. In this case, nonfiction. So we're working main idea. All right. The idea, or the main idea, is always the same thing in its basics. In its basics, it's nothing more than the subject, the main subject, plus the main verb. This will equal main idea. In one way or another, obviously, sometimes a subject is not a person, it's not a who, but a thing. It actually could be a feeling, it could be almost any noun that is the main point, the main noun within the passage, or in this case a paragraph. It could be a phrase, like in particular in this case. So when I look at something like this, I have to remember that I'm looking for the main subject and what action, the verb. That could be a be verb, was, so forth. So we have to consider that. So let's look up here. Here we have, well, quick read. The women's rights movement in the United States had its origin in the mid-19th century among the abolitionists and crusaders for social justice. Even among many of the activists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as Jane Addams and Florence Kelley, women's rights were merely a part of a larger cluster of civil rights for all people. Other reformers of this period, however, consider women's rights such as the right to vote or to earn equal pay the central idea, or the central issue. The women's rights movement achieved its most notable success during the Progressive era, when many reforms were adopted. These reforms included the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This amendment granted women the right to vote. Now, when looking at this passage, we have to consider the main subject. What is the main subject? We got, right in the first sentence, we have a phrase which gives us a pretty obvious who, or main subject, women's rights movement. We also look, as we look down the passage, we scan through it and work on it, we find over here women's rights are also a combination, one of the other. One is synonymic, basically. So now we got to figure out the main verb. What is, or was, or happens, or action is taking place in this passage that deals with the women's rights movement, or women's rights. If we look right next to this, here we have women's rights were merely a part of a larger cluster of civil rights. Merely a part, were, is your verb, merely a part of a larger cluster of civil rights. This shows a strong main idea connection, the subject plus the verb equaling the main idea. So what we do now is we take, okay, this is what it is. Then we got to take a look at the questioning here. If we take a look at the questioning, let me erase this real quick, get it all out of the way because it's getting in the way for us. Okay, here we go. If we take a look at the questioning, okay, let me get this thing moving here. We get a standard, what's the main idea of the passage? All right, let's take a quick look at what we're talking about. All right, let's say A. Since the early 20th century, many social reforms were adopted. Obviously, we don't see the term women's rights. We don't see women's rights movement. If we believe that the main subject deals with women's rights or women's rights movement, then this is an automatic cross-out. The subject is not in there. Neither is the verb for that matter, but the subject isn't in there. B, the women's rights movement grew out of a larger reform of movements. Well, we have women's rights. There's the women's rights movement. There's the subject, grew out. How does that work against the B verb? Were a part of a larger movement. Possibility. So this is a possibility. All right. If we take a look at C, women's voting rights were the most important issue during the Progressive Era. Two things here. This was not most important, was not clearly stated in the passage, and also this is a detail. They're only speaking of one issue, and within the passage you saw it spoke about several issues. And most important is a problem on all testing. Something that becomes an absolute, anything, everything, most important, least important. Often, 9 times out of 10, not the best choice to make unless you can really prove it in the passage. So we get rid of C. Down here we have the ratification of the 19th Amendment ended the struggle for women's rights. Well, the struggle for gender equality is still not over. So obviously it didn't end anything. This is not supported by the passage. Answer is B. And this is basically what you have to do. You have to take a look at these questions and then move along to the passage and prove, if I can get all these little lines out of the way. Oh, sorry about that. And prove your point. You got to prove. What's the prove it phrase? The prove it phrase, as we can actually say it is, early 20th century, the women's rights were merely a part of a larger, cluster of civil rights for all people. Here we have an example of how to find the main idea of, well, in this case, a paragraph. Now I want you to go to page 56 of the PDF form or booklet, depending on which, whether you have a handout or on computer. And do the same thing in small group, to break into small group, and do the same thing with the passage on 56. Thank you.